It is late October 1942. Inside the Panzerarmee Afrika Forward Headquarters at El Dabaa, the air is thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of engine oil carried in from the desert. A single aide stands motionless near the entrance, boots planted on bare concrete, his shadow thrown long and jagged across the eastern wall. Outside, the wind off the Mediterranean moves through the darkness in low, persistent surges. To the west, nothing. To the east, sound. Not artillery. Not yet. Something else. It is the sound of organized preparation. Engines, thousands of them. Tracked vehicles shifting into position across a front line that stretches nearly 60 kilometers from the sea to the Qattara Depression. The desert carries sound differently at night, and trained ears know to listen. The map on the table shows the current disposition of the Panzerarmee. German and Italian divisions arrayed in depth. Minefields, anti-tank screens, a defensive line constructed with care over weeks. It looks on paper like a structure that should hold. But the officer studying that map has not slept properly in 11 days. His name does not matter yet. What matters is what he knows, and what he has reported upward, and what has been done about it, which is almost nothing. Something has shifted on this front. The question is whether the men in command have accepted it yet. They have not. To understand what is about to happen to the Panzerarmee Afrika, it is necessary to understand how thoroughly it believed in its own position. By the autumn of 1942, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had built a reputation that transcended ordinary military celebrity. The campaigns of 1941 and the sweeping offensive of June and July 1942, which had driven British forces back nearly 900 kilometres from the Gazala line to El Alamein, had produced within German high command a settled confidence in Rommel's operational method. Speed, improvisation. The willingness to strike before the enemy had fully organised his response. These were the foundations of the Afrika Korps' success, and they had worked spectacularly well against a British command structure that was slow, compartmentalised, and frequently wrong in its estimates. By September 1942, Rommel's forces held a line from the coast at El Alamein south to the impassable salt marshes of the Qattara Depression. It was, in geographic terms, one of the few defensible positions in the entire Western Desert. Flanks that could not be turned. A compressed front that reduced the tactical advantage of superior numbers. Rommel himself had chosen it as a place where German and Italian forces could consolidate, resupply, and wait for the right moment to drive again toward Alexandria and the Suez Canal. The Panzerarmee's order of battle at this moment included the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions, the 90th Light Division, the Italian 20th Motorized Corps, and a string of infantry divisions, German and Italian, spread along the fortified line. In total, approximately 100,000 men, 500 tanks, and more than 1,200 artillery pieces faced eastward. The logistical picture was strained, but not yet desperate. Fuel convoys across the Mediterranean had been disrupted by British air and naval action, but enough supplies were arriving to sustain the defensive posture. Rommel's staff assessed that any British offensive, when it came, would require weeks of preparation, the kind of large-scale build-up that was visible from the air and interpretable by standard reconnaissance. They were right about one thing: the build-up was coming. What they were wrong about, fundamentally, catastrophically wrong about, was whether they would be able to see it clearly. The British had a problem they had been trying to solve for 2 years, and by the summer of 1942 they were beginning to solve it. The problem was Rommel himself, not his tactics, but his information. Throughout the desert campaigns, the Afrika Korps had benefited from a remarkable intelligence advantage. An American military attaché in Cairo, Colonel Bonifellas, had been sending detailed reports back to Washington describing British positions, strengths, intentions, and vulnerabilities. Those reports were encrypted in a code the Italians had broken. German and Italian intelligence received decoded transcripts of British operational planning with a regularity that amounted to having a liaison officer inside British 8th Army headquarters. Rommel's staff called this source the good source. It told them things they had no right to know. In the summer of 1942, the British discovered the breach. The good source went dark. Fellas was recalled. The flow of intelligence that had kept Rommel one operational step ahead of his opponents, that had allowed him to strike before British commanders had finished arguing about what to do, stopped. This was the first crack, and the Germans did not fully register it as a structural change. They assumed the disruption was temporary. They assumed their own reconnaissance and signals intelligence would compensate. They were wrong on both counts. At the same time, the British were doing something extraordinary on the desert floor east of Alamein. They were moving approximately 1,000 tanks, 900 artillery pieces, 200,000 troops, and an immense logistics infrastructure into position along a 60-kilometre front. And they were hiding it. Operation Bertram was the formal name for a deception operation of a scale and sophistication that the German intelligence apparatus simply was not prepared to process. British engineers constructed dummy tanks, hundreds of them, made from painted canvas and wood, positioned in the southern sector of the front. Real tanks were moved north, covered with identical-looking camouflage netting, and staged to appear, from the air, as supply dumps. A dummy pipeline was constructed heading south at a pace that suggested the main offensive would come in the south, and would come no earlier than November. Vehicles moved only at night. Radio discipline was strict. Formations maintained their peacetime frequencies and traffic patterns to give no indication of massing. German aerial reconnaissance flew over the line and brought back photographs. Analysts reviewed them. The photographs showed what the British intended them to show: an opponent who was still weeks away from readiness. In Rommel's headquarters, the intelligence picture showed a static front and an enemy in preparation. The timeline for a British offensive was assessed at late November, possibly December. Rommel himself had been flown back to Germany for medical treatment. Stomach ailments, exhaustion, circulatory problems accumulated over 2 years in the desert. His replacement, General Georg Stumme, was a capable officer, but new to the theatre and dependent on staff assessments, he had no personal basis to challenge. The warnings that did arrive were treated as manageable anomalies. A prisoner here, a patrol contact there. Reports from agents in Cairo that were ambiguous at best. The structural picture remained. The line was strong, the enemy was not ready, and the situation, while difficult, was under control. At 21:40 on the night of October the 23rd, 1942, the British opened fire along the entire El Alamein front. It was not a raid. It was not a probing attack. Nearly 900 artillery pieces fired simultaneously across a front that stretched from the Mediterranean coast to the Qattara Depression, and the sound reached German rear areas before any coherent report of what was happening could be assembled and transmitted. In the first 20 minutes alone, the British artillery fired more shells than the entire Panzer Army possessed in reserve. For the German and Italian infantry holding the northern sector, the effect was catastrophic. Communications lines buried in the desert floor were severed. Forward observation posts were destroyed. The intricate system of minefields and defensive positions, carefully mapped, carefully coordinated, became, in the darkness and the dust and the concussive shock, a landscape that the defenders could no longer fully comprehend. General Stumme drove forward to assess the situation personally. Somewhere near the front, his vehicle came under fire. Stumme, who had heart disease, suffered a cardiac event and died. For several critical hours, the Panzerarmee Afrika was without its commander at the moment it needed one most. Operation Lightfoot, the British infantry assault, began punching through the northern minefields behind the artillery barrage. The Australian 9th Division along the coast, the 51st Highland Division, the New Zealand 2nd Division, formations that had been invisible to German reconnaissance the previous day, were now pressing forward through lanes cut in the German defensive belt. Behind them, waiting for the corridors to open, were the armoured formations of X-Corps, the 1st and 10th Armoured Divisions, nearly 600 tanks preparing to pass through into the operational depths. The speed of the penetration shocked German forward commanders. Their intelligence had told them this attack was weeks away. The timeline in their heads, the timeline that shaped their defensive preparations and reserve positioning. It was built on information that had been carefully, deliberately fed to them. And now the timeline was being torn apart in real time by formations of a size and organization they had not believed were ready. Rommel was telephoned in Germany. He flew back to North Africa immediately. But the thing about losing the initiative is that it does not wait for the commanding general to return. Rommel landed in Africa on October 25th. He walked into a headquarters already in the grip of something his staff was struggling to name precisely. The situation maps were wrong, not in the sense that they contained errors. The officers updating them were doing their jobs. They were wrong in the sense that the reality they depicted kept changing faster than the maps could absorb it. A defensive position shown as intact in the morning briefing had been overrun by the afternoon. A minefield corridor shown as impassable had been breached. A counterattack ordered by division at dawn had achieved nothing by noon, and the division reporting back was asking for authorization to pull back to its secondary line. Rommel moved through the headquarters with the focused urgency that his staff recognized from the offensive campaigns of 1941 and 1942, but the atmosphere was different. In those campaigns, the maps had bent toward him. the red arrows had moved westward, toward the enemy. Now the pressures on the map were coming from the wrong direction. He ordered the 15th Panzer Division and the Littorio Armoured Division to counter-attack in the northern sector on October 25th. The attack went in against British armour that had now consolidated in the corridor west of the minefield belt. The result was brutal. British anti-tank guns. The 6-pounder had arrived in sufficient numbers by now to fundamentally alter the tank versus gun equation, and coordinated artillery support stopped the German armour in the open desert. Losses were significant. The corridor was not closed. A second counterattack was organised for the following day, this time with the 21st Panzer Division, brought up from the south. To move the 21st Panzer from its position required fuel. The fuel that arrived was not sufficient. The attack was delayed. The delay allowed British engineers to widen and consolidate the corridor. By the time the attack went in, the defensive perimeter it was supposed to destroy had grown stronger, not weaker. Inside the headquarters, the strain was beginning to show in the spaces between spoken words. Briefings ended and officers stood for a moment longer than necessary before dispersing to their duties. A staff major updated a position marker on the situation map and then stood looking at it without immediately returning to his seat. Rommel himself was heard speaking quietly to his operations officer late on the night of October the 26th in tones that the aide at the door could not quite hear but could feel. The question forming in the room, not yet spoken directly, not yet formally assessed, was whether the defensive line they had built and believed in had been constructed against an opponent they did not fully know. The logistical picture made everything worse. Fuel reserves were down to less than 3 days of mobile operations. The convoys crossing the Mediterranean were being found and sunk with a frequency that spoke of something systematic, as if the British knew where the ships were before they sailed. The Italian tanker Proserpina, carrying critical fuel, was sunk on October 26th. The tanker Tergesta was sunk the same day. The timing could not be coincidence, but making sense of it required acknowledging implications that were deeply uncomfortable. On November 2nd, 1942, General Bernard Montgomery launched Operation Supercharge. It was the concentrated punch after 9 days of attritional fighting. A carefully prepared assault aimed at the seam between German and Italian formations in the northern sector. 2 infantry brigades led, followed by the 9th Armoured Brigade, ordered to attack regardless of casualties, followed by the 1st Armoured Division, with orders to break out into the operational depths and destroy the Panzerarmee's remaining armour in the open desert. When the 9th Armoured Brigade went forward before dawn on November the 2nd, it attacked into a screen of 88mm guns and anti-tank positions that were, by any rational assessment, far better organised than they should have been after 9 days of sustained offensive pressure. The brigade took catastrophic losses, more than 70% of its tanks destroyed in a single engagement. But it broke through the anti-tank line, and the 1st Armoured Division poured through behind the wreckage. Rommel's remaining armour, the 15th Panzer Division, had fewer than 30 operational tanks. The 21st Panzer, fewer than 20, tried to form a blocking line in the open ground west of the breakthrough. They could not. There was not enough of it. The map and the headquarters at this moment told a story that everyone in the room could read. The defensive belt along which the Panzerarmee had built its position, through which it had threaded its supply lines, its communications, its sense of operational coherence, was no longer continuous. There were German and Italian formations still fighting inside that belt, isolated, no longer in contact with higher headquarters. There were other formations that had pulled back without authorization, because authorization was no longer reachable. The line that had looked, on paper, like a structure that should hold, was no longer a line. It was a series of positions. Rommel drafted a withdrawal order on the evening of November 2nd. Hitler countermanded it, the famous victory or death signal, demanding the Panzerarmee hold its ground. Rommel suspended the withdrawal for approximately 24 hours in agonized compliance with an order he knew was operationally lethal. On November 4th, with the 1st Armoured Division already in the open desert, west of El Alamein, and moving freely, he resumed the retreat regardless. The retreat from El Alamein would carry the remnants of the Panzerarmee across the entire breadth of North Africa. Through Libya, across the Libyan-Tunisian frontier, back into the Tunisian bridgehead, where in May 1943 the last organised Axis forces in Africa would surrender. Nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers would be taken prisoner. But the deeper meaning of what happened at El Alamein was not merely tactical, it was epistemic. The Panzer Army's confidence in its own intelligence, the confidence built on 2 years of operating with better information than the enemy, of knowing where the British were, what they intended, when they would move, had been its operational foundation. That foundation had been quietly, methodically destroyed by an intelligence and deception apparatus that Rommel's headquarters never fully detected and never fully understood. The good source that had told them everything was gone. The machinery that replaced it, ultra-intercepts, the 20 Committee, the elaborate fabrications of Operation Bertram, was producing not information but certainty, a false certainty about what the battlefield looked like and what the enemy was about to do. Rommel had built his method of war on speed, on acting before the enemy could respond, on knowing more than he should have known. At El Alamein, that method was turned against him, not by a better general, though Montgomery was a capable and careful one, but by an intelligence framework that had been watching every movement, reading every signal, and feeding back exactly what it wanted him to see. He had not lost because he was outfought, though he was. He had lost because he had been operating for months without knowing it, inside someone else's picture of the war. And when the map finally told the truth, there was nothing left to do but retreat into a desert that was already behind him.